All right. Hello, people. It's been a while. Just so you know, the reason for why we haven't podcasted in a while, for those who do listen to us, it's because we've been busy. I've moved to Germany, and Oliver is studying and working in the medical field. So there's some interesting things we could talk about both of these events that I think you may find very interesting. Perhaps on my other sort of solo podcast, Mind of James, I'll talk about the things that happened to me since my move to Germany, and Oliver has had some interesting developments in the food and medical industry as well. So keep an eye out for Golt's Perspective, which is his solo
Um,
podcast. All right, so today we're talking about infinite regress. Oliver has written a statement or a sort of argument, mm, excuse me, about infinite regress. So I'm going to start dictating it and then we can get into it a little bit more
you want to read
deeply.
it out?
I'll read it out. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so the fundamental issue, as far as I can tell, is that the fact that anything exists at all makes zero sense in the context of modern rationalism. Our current logic follows cause and effect, chronology, which dismisses magical thought, that something can come from nothing. But isn't the whole idea of the Big Bang kind of irrational? Something out of nothing? I mean, they can fancy it up with terms like point of infinite density in a complete vacuum or something like that. But if we really want to keep things pragmatic, then there has to be a beginning and an end, as they say, making heads and tails of it. Where'd that point of infinite density come from, eh? I mean, furthering this perspective somewhere back in time, time had to begin. It must have come from nothing. Or no, you say there was a thing before that. But what was before that thing? And then before that? Does it go on forever, or did it pop out of nothingness? Both are pretty insane, but what other options are there? We're left here simply to marvel stupidly and appreciate everything. Existence is the very definition of miracle. Either it popped out of complete nothing, or it is infinite, or it's something completely beyond our comprehension, or all three. Um, that's a great little statement. And you said you wrote this when?
I think I found it in a journal entry from before high school.
Okay.
So probably between the ages of 10 and 13.
hmm And that's what I found interesting when you said you wrote this several, like many years back. It kind of lets you know that the question of infinite regress is something that maybe not all kids, I mean, let's admit it, you're a bit of an eccentric guy and special in your own way. So, but I think most people, I would say, yeah, most people, regardless of age, gender, culture, background, whatever, if anybody asks themselves enough questions, they'll eventually hit infinite regress.
Yes.
So that statement was, let's say, it was interesting, but also like the questions that you sort of posed are something from the perspective of the kid, of course. How would you formulate your question as to what infinite regress really is or what it represents in some manner as you are today as an adult and philosopher?
How would I pose the question, you
Yeah,
said?
how would you present the problem of infinite regress, and how would you reformulate those questions with a little bit more sophistication and clarity?
Honestly, I think it's pretty well said right there. But hmm, that's the thing. I've read it over and I've considered rewriting it.
hmm
You know, if is there something I would like to change? And I mean, over the last 2 years since I found it, I don't really have any updates to make on it. It's something that you have to maybe reread a few times
Yeah.
to really let it sink in.
Okay. So,
But
do you mind if I
it's
pick it
pretty
apart?
complete. Yeah, sure, go for it.
All right. So I just think like the it's a little bit messy, but um, I mean, there all the points are there. I would think the important points as to what infinite regress is, and maybe to launch us off into this, I can just tell the story. Just prior to starting this podcast, I was speaking with my mother, and then she asked me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm about to do this podcast." And she's like, "What's it going to be about?" So I told her infinite regress, and she was like, "Well, what's infinite regress?" So I asked her a question that I knew was going to end up kind of being challenging to explain, because she she's very interesting in that way. So I say, well, infinite regress. If I ask you the question, who created God? Straight up, she says just, well, nobody, no one. You know what I mean? So that kind of puts a barrier right there already in the question of infinite regress. I mean, if you come to a conclusion right away, you say nothing created God, you're limiting yourself. It just shows you that you're limiting yourself
What?
to a belief at this point. That's not to say that you're limiting yourself in a bad way. It's not what I'm trying to say. But what you are doing is that you're limiting yourself to a belief. You're not allowing yourself to question something, therefore, investigate it further. So after explaining that, I had to say, well, the next question would be, well, who created God? Whatever answer you come up with, whether it's something objective, like some other being created, even greater, and then turtles all the way down type thing, you would have to keep asking, well, what created that, and then what created that, and so on and so forth. So that's like the simplest way we can really talk about infinite regress as to what it is. It's perhaps the most existential question you can ask after the biggest one, which is, why is there something rather than nothing? Right? So you can ask that why, which has to do with purpose. But if you want to start questioning cause and effect, which means, well, what started it? And that's the logical question to ask after.
And we use cause and effect to analyze everything in our lives, and we assume everything follows those laws.
Exactly. And it's like I said, I think the first question is, why is there something rather than nothing? When you realize this has to do with purpose, and it's not something you can actually answer when it comes to a global, decisive, existential answer for everybody, you can only answer it for yourself. Then yeah, the natural question to ask is what created everything? And then you could always fall into infinite regress after that, because whatever answer you come up with, whether it's God, whether it's evolution, whether it's physics just out of nowhere, whether it's a vacuum, like people say, point of densities, that kind of stuff, what created that? That's the infinite regress part.
Right.
So I just wanted to establish that for anybody who's listening who has heard the term thrown around, or maybe has never heard of it, but it sounds cool, and they're like, "Oh, what's infinite regress?"
It's not discussed much, which I find shocking.
Yeah, well, it should
It's
be,
so
because
fundamental.
I think it definitely is one of the causes for why we have like these circular discussions over and over again. We kind of talk about things, from one side of the fence or the other, and it's never ending. And people, I don't think, understand that at the root of a lot of conversations is the problem of infinite regress.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like that you brought up the religious side of it, the God side, because I, in the text, bring up the scientific perspective, the Big Bang, which I guess some people would argue is kind of just a placeholder, but to me, that's a cop out, because you're not addressing some major fucking issues with the basic philosophical premises of science itself. If you're not addressing that, you just say, well, it just happened, so let's figure out everything after that. And that's true. We can't constantly worry about that. We do have to focus on things here and now. But
Exactly, and that's a beautiful segue into, I think, going a little bit further with this conversation, which would be, I'm going to echo what Sam Harris said once at a public talk. He said something like, "It's kind of funny that you're giving up a perfectly serviceable Tuesday night." Yes, that was the night that we were talking. To come and listen to us tell you in every which way that that we don't know. I think the discussion was, we don't know. We have no idea where God came from, or whether God exists or not. So it's kind of a funny thing. So basically, I'm going to echo that and say, ultimately, there's no answer for infinite regress in the let's say linear, straightforward kind of logical conclusion that we tend to seek.
in the materialist reductionist way, but in a
Exactly.
purely logical and, well, yeah, logical, really transcendentally logical way, we can answer that question.
Yes, we can answer this question and I guess to simplify what you said, in a paradoxical manner,
Mm-hmm.
which means that it's not going to be a decisive conclusion. It's going to be a sort of duality that we're going to create like image, so that whoever's listening or watching could perhaps understand how you could go beyond infinite regress in terms of feeling existential or thinking about the universe in which we inhabit, which was something that we kind of mulled over a few nights ago when we were talking about existence and non-existence coexisting.
Right.
For anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff, Oliver and I are creating a philosophy called the Cogito Paradoxon, in which we talk about a lot of these kinds of topics and we bring things together. But one small part of the philosophy is to deal with this infinite regress issue. And the way we tend to explain, let's just say, existence and how it can come to exist without falling into infinite regress is it's predicated by the question, can existence and non-existence coexist? Right? So
that can be a hard one to unpack.
it is hard to unpack, but maybe we can go into what you were talking about to explain this sort of frequency between, the void of existence and then existence, and how the two necessitate each other, but the sort of boundary between the two, how that frequency is itself the very thing that you can't explain, but the non-existence and existence themselves, you can actually hold those ideas in your mind and understand how all can come to be by compartmentalizing, the one, more, let's say, clarified points that you can't truly understand, which is that sort of frequency between the two.
Well, the first step I'd say here is start, just for now, just as a mental exercise, considering existence as more of a conceptual construct as opposed to directly physical. So just try this. Instead of thinking that it works linearly, as in first there was nothing and then there was something, well, you can see in every aspect of life that there are themes of nothingness and somethingness kind of reflecting each other all the time. Let's just take music or space. In music, there's space between the notes, and it's what gives the music shape. The space in between things is what gives the shapes shape, right? Mm-hmm. And if you see it as linear time-wise, sure, maybe there was a big bang, but that doesn't explain the beginning of existence. What that would be, something would have had to exist before that, and something before that, and there would be spaces of nothingness in between. Perhaps they're only localized, but all to say, it's a conceptual thing where these two opposing themes balance each other out. So it's something that transcends time and linear time. It's a perfect concept that kind of equalizes itself. If you look at any form of duality like black and white, they're not actually separate. There's a whole spectrum in between, right? So maybe there's also a spectrum of somethingness and nothingness. This is again just a mental exercise. Mm-hmm. that might lead people a little bit closer to what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think I would go a little bit even. I would go further to try to, I guess, create that image in a manner that's even more vivid. I think people can easily fall into the pitfall of trying to imagine void or non-existence, and then they immediately think of black.
Yeah.
But here's where I think it gets kind of tricky, because if you want to sort of think about non-existence, then, which is the absence of even a color of any kind of construct. In fact, void is something that cannot be conceptualized at all.
Right.
So the best
Nothing is
way,
nothing.
so technically and ironically, in a sense, the only way to conceptualize what cannot be conceptualized is to not conceptualize it. So it's paradoxical, right? Hence why our philosophy always kind of comes back down to paradoxism. But anyway, so
We're breaking down and organizing all of these things that ultimately break down into circular logic, I guess.
exactly, exactly. So I would just strive to, I guess, tell people to not think about non-existence, just to
Or
think about
useless.
existence as necessitating non-existence. It means that, in order for existence to exist, it needs void,
Mm-hmm.
which
Well,
is
here,
again paradoxical in nature because void can't really exist beside non-existence in a physical manner, in a space-time construct.
right.
So it's this kind of loop in your head that kind of, but as long as you're aware that you're creating this paradox in your head, that's really the point here.
Exactly. And I mean, we can conceive of, how do I say, degrees of nothingness, right? So
Mhm.
the air around me could be conceived of as nothingness, but no, there is oxygen, there are gases, and then you could compare that to a gas, right? Or an electromagnetic field. It's nothing, but it's something. And then you compare those to a more extreme degree of nothingness, like deep space. Is it actually nothingness? Not quite, because it's contrasted by the physical, the more somethingness things that are present, right? So it is also a spectrum between something and nothingness.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. Um, it's kind of a strange one to hold in your head while you're thinking about the rest of what we're about to try and explain. But I mean, hopefully, people are at least kind of interested in oh, what are they talking about? Because it's not something that people usually talk about, right? They think of non-existence as being, like you said, something that goes prior to the boundary of space-time. It's like, well, before space-time was created, it had to have been something we don't understand, whether it's God or some kind of, you know, event like a false vacuum fluctuating space-time into existence, whatever.
Something that's complicated that only the scientists understand.
Exactly. So I think, like you said, I think not enough people are really kind of thinking about the questions that nobody is really asking. I mean, I mean, I'm pretty sure we're not the first ones to think about existence and non-existence, but maybe it's definitely not something that people are thinking about necessarily. They should be thinking about this a lot more, which is the idea that existence and non-existence must coexist.
Right.
Um,
And
so
and we will eventually lead this to practical applications. It's not just mind fuckery. Everything is connected to everything, and these themes are ultimately fundamental in how we approach the world, how we see the world, how we treat the world, and what we're going to create out of it. So we do have to think about these things. Yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah.
I want to point out two things first before we launch into this even more. One, I mean, we're bound by logic. We have to think about things in a logical manner. And so when we're talking about these things, especially when, like you said, if we're going to try to derive any practicality from it, we can easily, and there's a caveat here, but we can easily be told, what you're talking about has no basis. But this would be the material reductionist point of view. I mean, if you can't explain it with logic, then or with some kind of evidence, then it's not worth being talked
But
about or something
what
like
we
that. And then
just did with the issue of infinite regress is that is logic debunking itself.
yeah, well, ooh, that's an interesting thing. We could talk about that too. But I just want people to know that what we're talking about is extremely off the map. We're not making any claims as to, you know, this is the way things are. We're just conjecturing. We're thinking about this, how it could be. This is the only way we could come to understand the nature of reality purely philosophically, with as much logic as possible. So sometimes my argument is that it's logical to be illogical, right? It's only logical. Like if for example, I can make things a lot more efficient in my life or in society, but ultimately I'm neglecting what I want. And usually what you want, emotionally speaking, as a human being, is irrational. It's not logical. We want things that we shouldn't want if you take the perspective of efficiency, excuse me.
I would argue to say that it's never purely irrational. It
Sure.
generally follows certain guidelines, but there is a strong aspect of irrationality to it.
Yeah. It just depends. It depends by what context you're looking at it from, like what filter, right? Like if you want to survive, sure, emotion is completely irrational. You should leave it behind. But what the fuck is the point of surviving if you can't enjoy yourself? Which I guess there's no logic in throwing a ball around for fun when you're talking about survival of species or propagation of society or any kind of efficiency, right? So I just want people to realize that these kinds of topics are extremely transcendental, extremely metaphysical, and yeah, there's the caveat. So that leads me into going back to what we were talking about. Can existence and non-existence coexist? So this idea that you and I have been tinkering over, which is the answer that they actually must, or actually
they're actually part of the same thing ultimately.
Exactly, is something that we try to understand with as much logic as possible, but the kind of logic that I was just talking about, the one that tells you it makes sense to go against logic. It's logical to go against logic in a sense.
Yeah.
It's paradoxical in nature, which would be predicated by the question, which I think can make people understand a little bit more of what we're talking about. It started out with the idea that there are three answers to whether existence and non-existence can coexist. There are three answers you could give to this. One, yes, right? Existence and non-existence can coexist. They do. Two, no. It was a void. There was non-existence, and then at some point there was existence, and it's existence infinitely. And then three. So hold on. It was one that existence cannot coexist. Let's start with that one first. Existence cannot coexist with non-existence. It was just one happened and then the other, and that's it. It's an infinite of existence right now. Whereas before the Big Bang, it was an infinite of an infinity of non-existence, just void. The second, of course, is sorry, I'm a bit tired. I'm drinking beer too. Second would be the whether non-existence and coexistence can exist. The second answer you could come up with is, oh, fuck, man. Like I'm really. Wow, hold on.
No worries.
I just wanted to point out basically that whichever answer you come up with, there's the definite sort of logical consistency that the infinite is always there. There's always the aspect of infinity there.
Right. Well, be it nothing or something, it would have had to be infinite or something beyond the concept of time.
Exactly, but it just
which
makes
is
sense.
In a sense infinite.
Yeah, like the conceptual, pure conception of the infinity, whether it's physical or non-physical is what I'm trying to say. That's what I'm saying. Existence or non-existence. Existence is something that has to do with physics or material in some way, whereas non-existence has to do with the lack of material, the lack of physical existence.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's clear that whichever answer you come up with, the infinite, the idea of something going on forever, it's never ending, that it's clear, philosophically speaking and logically speaking, it's clear that it just is. The infinite is, regardless of what you think about existence and non-existence, whether they coexist or not. So that sets up for us the basis, the foundation for, transcending infinite regress. It basically says, there's some kind of foundation, and this foundation is purely philosophical. It's a pure concept. It transcends any logic, even in a sense.
Right.
Through this one logical idea of the infinite, you can transcend all the other logical sort of rules that we're bound by. Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yep.
I made myself a little bit more clear. Okay.
Well, to me at least.
Yeah, no, we're trying to get better at this podcasting thing, and it's been a while. So.
Well, we've taken a big break. So.
Yeah, but again, so if we want to stick to the idea of infinite regress, maybe we should think about those questions a little bit more before we move on to trying to beat infinite regress.
Well, are we really trying to beat it? I mean,
well, we're trying to think beyond it. I mean, it doesn't serve any purpose to just say, "Oh yeah, it's an infinite regress." I mean, infinite regress doesn't give you any practicality. All it says is, again,
no, it's in a sense, it's an argument to not always be logical, that there is a purpose and there is a place ultimately for something that is beyond beginning and end, clear cause and effect. I mean, of course, I could explain something like art as having a practical value because it makes my brain relax, so then I can come back stronger and rested to my rational life, right? But it also gives a purpose to life. It gives me a reason to work in the first place so I can enjoy it.
Well, yeah. I mean, but here's the argument, though. I mean, the whole reason for why we're trying to understand infinite regress in a different way is because you can create purpose beyond, but not beyond the parameters that you're setting for yourself. If you're saying, I stop questioning, my cause and effect, let's say parameters, right? In terms of a linear time framework, let's say, I stop at God. God created everything, and God, when I die, after I die, will have revealed to me the ultimate purpose of life. But between these two parameters, I create for myself purpose. I'm around to spread the word of God, or I'm around to become a jazz flute player, or whatever the fuck, right? So infinite regress is the idea that you don't put yourself, any parameters. You're questioning God himself or the lack of God or whatever it is in an infinitely regressive manner. So that doesn't bring you any practicality. So you're stuck between having to either set those parameters and that's it, the discussion stops, or discussing infinite regress. So if you're going to discuss infinite regress, you got to find a way to extract some kind of practicality or some kind of conclusion from it. I mean, otherwise you're going around in circles. It's an immediate stop to any thought to just say, okay, well, I could think about, void creating something out of nothing, right? And this is it. That's where it would end. But where you and I have sort of tried to further the discussion is to think of infinite regress as being some kind of positive feedback loop, which is the interaction between void and existence. And through that, we've been able to extract some kind of possible practical answer as to how the nature of reality functions. So what we're trying to think about is if you see, I mean, obviously I have no choice to use a visual that's physical, and it doesn't make sense completely for the argument. But if I take two hands, my hands, I put them side by side. One of them represents existence, the other represents the void or non-existence. The space that is between the two, whatever interaction there seems to be, happens to be very similar to a frequency, right? I mean, if you look at quantum physics, you look at everything. It's why we think that
particles appearing and disappearing out of
exactly. Frequency it's a regular pattern that emerges seemingly out of nowhere. So let's take that to its logical conclusion. If it's out of nowhere, perhaps it truly is out of nowhere. But the way we can reformulate that sort of idea is that it's not necessarily coming out of nowhere. It's coming out of the interaction between void and existence. And so the interaction between the two could very well be what creates or what causes the sort of frequency that we're talking about, the sort of interval of patterns. And those interval of patterns, there could be one main one, which is the biggest frequency, which would be the interaction of existence and non-existence, together.
And
And
then
then
everything else is a reflection of that, but a little bit different or smaller.
exactly. And then all the other frequencies that we see in the universe around us must therefore come from that one main frequency. So, the way that we can translate that into human meaning in a sense would be, well, that frequency seems to be something you can access through meditation, right? When you feel one and existential in some manner, that's literally almost access to that main bandwidth, that main frequency that would be an interaction between the two. So that's where I was just trying to lead us towards the practicality of the topic of infinite regress, right?
Right.
Because there's no actual way to talk about infinite regress beyond, well, that's it. All you can say is let's question what came before that and what came before that.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of doing that, we've created a paradox so that we can maybe from there talk about more of your frequency work, and why it could be very, let's say, practical.
Well, we got to be careful when we go into that area because it can so easily lead into pseudoscience, and things need to be tested out enormously.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, we do know that, you play the frequency of glass and the glass will shatter, right? Frequencies do have an effect and they're everywhere, and everything is technically vibrating at some rate, has its own frequency. So reality is fundamentally frequency of some type of stimulus that is appearing in and out of reality. Everything is some degree of that at different patterns. That's what we can reduce it to.
Yeah. Maybe we can tell people what Karl Popper had to say about pseudoscience, the difference between pseudoscience and actual science. Because again, I think with the nature of what we're talking about here, we're talking about something paradoxical. So it may be, in a sense, something that has to be inverted, maybe. Like, science has to do with falsifying, let's say, things. Or, do you know what I mean? If you falsify something, then, whatever result remains seems to be the truth or the facts.
Explain the process of falsification, because that word isn't clear, I think.
Yeah, actually, would you do that for me, please?
Mm. Well, are you talking about basically deduction? That's what I'm trying to figure out. I don't know exactly how you're using that word.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just want to explain the difference between science and pseudoscience, and I think you're better equipped to do that than I am.
Well, I mean, I would use a different term than that. First of all, I'd say anyone who says anything with certainty isn't technically really being scientific. First of all, first thing that I always come to is correlation does not prove causation. And science is a constant process of refinement. It's the process of questioning and testing, and there's always more variables to control for. So basically, what I'm saying, if we're going to go by the authoritarian, now we're getting into a whole other topic, but the authoritarian perspective of science, and say, well, this authority said this is true, so it's true. I'm sorry, I'm not going to agree with that. But at the same token, you can't take someone who says, well, when you're relaxed, then you suddenly access the quantum field and then you can think things and it'll make them real, or some shit like that. Maybe it's true. But what I'm saying is that we have to be careful because we can't know that. We can't prove that. Maybe it's totally true and maybe it's totally unprovable. But when someone says, well, everything is frequency and that's science, so your frequency, so if you get into the same frequency as something that you want, you can have it. I'm talking about the law of attraction, if anyone is wondering. Well, guess what? That's unprovable. So it's pseudoscience as soon as someone tells you that is absolutely true, and it's bullshit if someone tells you it's not. You see
Yeah,
what I'm saying?
well, I mean, I think absolute truths, they kind of exclude all science, pseudo or otherwise. I think that there isn't, I mean,
Yeah.
we don't, again, this has to do with paradoxes, of course. It always goes back down to paradox, but, is there such a thing as absolute truth? So if you say there is no, there is no such thing as an absolute truth, is that the truth? It's only possible next to its impossibility. But for the purposes of moving forward with our discussion, what I meant was, pseudoscience, as Karl Popper seemed to have explained it, is using things from the past, regular occurring patterns, making connections between all of these patterns to support some kind of desired statement. And then science seems to be something that projects into the future, so that if you falsify anything, if you say, well, here are the patterns that do not occur, these are things that absolutely do not happen, so therefore going into the future we're certain that they're not going to happen, because we've observed them for a certain amount of time with certain means to determine that yes, they will not indeed continue on into the future. So it seems to be a past and future thing. They're literally dealing with the nature of time. That's what
Yeah. Cause and
science.
effect. Heads and
Cause and
tails.
effect. Exactly. The duality is everywhere in that sense. And again, it becomes paradoxical at some point.
Yeah.
So, like you said, if we want to extract any kind of practicality from the idea, the paradoxical state of existence itself, if we think about things not as infinite regress, or because here's what I think. I think religious people or spiritual people who use an anthropomorphic god or any kind of force or unified theory out of nowhere, they they overcome infinite regress in a negative manner by just stopping, just brute stop at that question. Just nope, we won't know, and we'll know after we die. Whereas the others, the scientifics, they don't do any better. I mean, in science, you say, yeah, we don't know, but we're working on it, and it's just like, well,
That's what they should be doing.
it's what they should be doing, but it's not satisfying, and it doesn't bring us any meaning, any human values. And
Okay.
this is why philosophy is important. And so, if you want to overcome both of these just stop measures, which is, well, we don't know yet, but we're working on it, or we will never know, and we'll know after we die, or whatever it is. It doesn't help us extract any practicality when it comes to morality, for example, or when it comes to purpose. How do we
That's the
think about
thing.
purpose? How do we?
I know a lot of atheistic, well, here, morality could be something that could be partially derived logically and partially derived through basic intuition and feeling. Or what one extreme does is that they make a bunch of rules, and then the other extreme ends up saying that there's no such thing as morality. If you take a purely rationalistic, or I would say cause and effect point of view, then there's no way that we can prove that there's any value to life, that there's no way of quantifying appreciation, for example, or experience of any kind. So then it's just, at that point, are you just going to throw it out? Are you going to just say there's no such thing as it, because there's no such thing as good or good feeling or love or gratitude, just because you can't put it down on paper, or you can't see the beginning and end of it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Even
So
if you reduce it to chemicals and you're like, oh, well, it's just chemicals, then it doesn't mean anything. Well, wait a second. Your experience, there's a difference between the experience and the chemicals. You see what I'm saying?
yeah, but this always comes back down to the hard problem of consciousness. But just to keep things
Yeah,
on track,
of course.
basically, what I'm trying to say is that you know if you take the philosophical approach to try to understand, the nature of reality so that you can extract practicality, you're inevitably going to run into what we're talking about, which is science and pseudoscience, right? We will obviously not be up to standard on, I don't think, either. It's not pseudoscience and it's not science either. It's
Yeah.
pure
Yeah, exactly.
philosophical conjecture. It's a choice to, um, to create out of a metaphysical sort of questioning some new way of thought. So it's not even proof. It's just how can we think about the biggest existential questions in a different manner? And the manner we're proposing is a paradoxical manner, right? So if we think about the nature of existence not as being something that is in a closed system of existence, right, which would be science, or something that encompasses existence and non-existence, which would be more the spiritual approach, right? God, there was God at the beginning, and nobody ever defines it, but they say at the beginning, before there was anything, there was God. It created everything, and that's it. So, I guess in the philosophical approach that we're taking, it kind of resembles the latter rather than the former, which would be the spiritual approach. But in fact, I think we're merging the two. We're making it paradoxical. We're saying that the two necessitate each other, and they have always been. Because we do have the philosophical foundation that the infinite as a concept is probably the most logical, rational thing you can think about. It seems to be something that we do not need. We don't need the computing ability, let's say. We don't need the intellect or the power of consciousness to encompass the infinite. All we got to do is understand it. And it's quite easy to understand. It's almost like inevitable to understand that the idea of the infinite existing is inevitable. That's the argument. And from there, when we try to extract practicalities, what we're doing, in fact, is not setting to, any kind of proof or evidence or even a syllogism for an argument. It's just creating a new way of thinking so that we can perhaps apply meaning to the existential questions like, what is purpose, what is happiness, what is morality, and we can define those things in a new way, possibly in the future.
Another thing it does is that it bridges the gap between perspectives that are very polarized, that seem at opposition to each other, such as religion and science.
Yes.
This is an incredibly logical way for both of them to understand where the pitfalls are and what they have to learn from each other and what's in between.
Exactly. So it would minimize the sort of polarization of ideas at the same time, because that's the beautiful thing about paradox, is that it brings together two seemingly opposing ideas. Yeah. So there you go. Okay, so I just pulled up the thing I kind of foolishly wasn't even able to put out there, and it's here. Okay, so basically the question is, can existence and non-existence coexist? There are three answers to this paradox. 1, no, existence is infinite. That's that. 2, nothing actually exists. It's an infinity of non-existence. And then 3, yes, somewhere or when at the boundary of existence, there is somehow an infinity of non-existence that begins and or ends. Right.
By the way, can I offer an example, just a visualization to make this easier for people? Sure. Think of a simulation online, or on a computer. If you go to the end of the simulated world, what's out there? Is that nothingness? It's a simulated nothingness. It's like it's nothing that is nothing. It gives you a bit of a step closer towards what we're talking about.
Exactly. Right? That the visual for that purpose, it would work. Yeah. So exactly, if you think no existence is infinite, then all you would see on the horizon of that game, like maybe Grand Theft Auto, is just a skyline. And then you just can't go further, but you know that there's a skyline, so it must go on forever. There must be other cities and whatever. In the second example, nothing actually exists. It's an infinity of non-existence. Well, this is kind of like the Buddhist approach in a sense, right? Maybe it's just, it's all an illusion, somehow there is no material world and it's just pure consciousness, maybe. And that's why there's all this kind of,
I would say
seemingly,
both, once again.
yeah. And then
Illusion and
three,
illusion.
yeah, but then three, yes, somewhere between the boundary of existence, there is an infinity of non-existence. That's where you can't conceptualize it. It's impossible, but it would be like void in a sense. So again, this is just to frame an argument, or like if you, so that anybody who thinks about infinite regress can really leverage themselves into this mode of paradoxical thinking, right? So it gives you a foundation, and the foundation is that all three answers to the question point to the very real fact that the infinite is always a constant, right? So however you want to answer that question, whether existence and non-existence can coexist, it's clear that the infinite is a component of every one of those answers. So that's your foundation right there. After that, step two is to try to think about, non-existence not as being a physical place or a construct, a part, but from not existing itself. Just to think about existence, right? So if you think of existence, but it's sort of being pulled and pushed, from the void somehow. It's interacting with void, even though the void doesn't exist. That's step two. And then the interaction between the two, if you want, again, whether they are two or just one, because again, it's all infinite. There seems to be some kind of interaction. That's all we're saying. Whether it's physical or non-physical, that's the one thing that we can't really prove, but we seem to observe there being patterns, and these patterns are what we call frequencies. And these frequencies, this is one way we could start thinking about how they come into being, which is some kind of interaction that's happening. And that interaction happens between existence and non-existence. Even though
what's a good,
that's it. That's basically the I think we're making it more clear now.
right. And here's another way to conceive of the nothingness that is nothing, that is nothing. Is well, we're constantly dealing with the unknown, right?
Yeah.
With projections of the future, with what's out there, what's beyond our ability to sense, and beyond our knowledge of how things work. We're constantly interacting with the unknown in different ways, and that's exactly the same thing. You see what I'm saying? It works on conceptual, mental levels as well. We see it on physical levels, but it's also us dealing with the complete void of knowing that is around us constantly.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. I like that. So, this is one way to beat infinite regress. It's one way to think yourself further from, further than just the two other options, which is to set those parameters we were talking about. And I think that's where all the interesting questions come into being, and the ones that really matter to us in terms of practicality, right? So how do we jump from, one, we have this foundation, which is the infinite. Two, we have a possible explanation for how frequency or patterns come into being, which is that interaction that we were talking about. So how do you get from those steps to step three? Well, how does this kind of reality reflect or inform us as to what purpose is, what morality is, what good and evil are, all these sort of other questions that really pertain to our lives a lot more. So maybe we can start digging into a little bit of those. Remember, we can maybe reiterate one of the first podcasts, which was on purpose. And the way that It was the first? Yes, it was the first. So I think it's an interesting thing that we're sort of circling back to it, because the question there was, again, we're using this model of paradoxism. I mean, it's a paradox for there to not be a beginning nor an end to anything, right? The infinite itself is a paradox. This is our foundation. So if the foundation is a paradox, it seems to follow that everything else afterwards seems to be paradoxical in nature as well. So, like, again, how
Well, it
can
would have to be
existence,
a
how
limited
could,
reflection of it.
exactly, like, but so if we think about, if we explain the first two levels we've just explained in terms of paradoxes, let's explain it this way: the alpha and omega, beginning and end. If the infinite is true, then there was no beginning to the infinite, and there was no end to it. If you even if you take away, existence and non-existence, you take that out of the equation, whether physicality was there or not there in any way, shape, or form, how can the infinite not have begun and not have ended? This is paradoxical in nature. So that foundation, even though it's a paradox, just is a brute fact. It exists. So then the second one, which was the interaction, let's say, how can void interact with existence? How can the two coexist? Again, it's paradoxical in nature. They seem to have no choice to coexist. Um, you know, so we, as a pure decision, we're not saying that there's any proof, because I don't think we've developed the philosophy in that area enough to really come up with decent arguments as to support the statement definitively that it's true that existence and non-existence coexist. They just must,
Well,
by induction of the fact that it's
that
all
is
paradoxical.
unprovable.
Yeah, it's exactly. So if we go with that one, that's the one that seems to bring us the most practicality. If that's how frequency comes to exist, which is an interaction between void and non-existence, which is paradoxical in nature, then it follows that everything else afterwards will be paradoxical. So finally, when we get into the idea of purpose, which is ironically, maybe not so ironically, it has to do with infinite regress. Purpose is something that you can't reach a bedrock for. You can't say, okay, the ultimate purpose of everything. You can't have that, because the foundation tells us that everything is paradoxical in nature. Therefore, you have to think about purpose in a different manner. And the way that we had stated how we can think about purpose is to think of the question, what is the antithesis to purpose? What is the opposite of purpose? Can you take it from there, please?
Well, this was originally your argument, so I probably might go. I'll probably go into a different direction than you did, but I mean, very simply, you could say that purpose, whatever the antithesis to purpose is, necessitates purpose, and purpose necessitates it. They both have to exist in the first place. Like, I want to unpack this, because it would be, how do I say, more useful for people if we really explain it a little bit better. So, I mean, it's pretty basic. Again, I am going to come back to the theme of white and black. Mm-hmm. You can't have white without black, mm-hmm. Right? Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. It's contrast, ultimately. If there was an ultimate purpose to everything all the time, you wouldn't be able to distinguish it from anything else. You see?
Exactly. Yeah. And it sort of echoes, again, the very paradoxical nature of reality. I mean, if there is no antithesis to purpose, because there isn't, and yet there is at the same time. That's where the paradox comes in. You can't have an opposite of purpose.
Why there is no antithesis to purpose?
Well, I mean, the antithesis would, whatever the antithesis would be, and that's where my argument came in, is that if you had an opposite to purpose, it would immediately take on purpose in itself, because its purpose would be to be the opposite of purpose. Therefore, it represents void, and again, yet there is an antithesis to purpose, which is void, which is the antithesis to purpose.
Exactly.
it's
And it doesn't exist, but it exists.
but it exists, exactly. It becomes paradoxical in nature because purpose in itself only becomes possible next to its impossibility, which is the antithesis of itself. So that's basically the contrast you were talking about. I just formulated it in a more of a question. So this is again the beautiful, and I love your smile, because that's how I this is the many times we both smiled at each other like this, and I just want people to kind of get that same smile, like, oh, I understand now, like, here's how we can clarify something that seems impossible. It's like it's not necessarily impossible to understand the impossible, right? You just have to think about things in a more paradoxical manner, and you can actually hold these two contradicting, or at least seemingly contradicting ideas into your head. So, um,
And by the way, this might sound pretty crazy, but if people listen to this stuff a lot,
yeah,
you might find yourself doing it without even knowing how it works. It's because it's as much as it is rational, it is also, I guess you could say, intuitive and natural. It has a natural flow to it. It's weird. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. I can't explain it better than you just did. But now, I mean, this still doesn't bring you to, like, I mean, some average Joe somewhere could be like, including this one, could be like, well, that doesn't tell me whether I should, let's say, become a fucking stockbroker. You know what I mean? Do I? Is that my purpose in life? So at the end of the day, um, I want people to understand that if you understand the nature of purpose, you can move on towards life and move on towards answering those very real, concrete questions with a little bit more ease. That's something that obviously we're not trying to create like framework. We're not trying to say, so A, B, C, and D, therefore you should fuck, Charlotte. You know what I mean? Or therefore you should sell your house. Exactly. Versus Christine. So at the end of the day, purpose is intrinsic to itself, just like existence seems to be intrinsic to itself. There is no definitive answer in the way you would like it, and yet there is, which is the fact that whatever decisions you'll make, they are purposeful. There is purpose intrinsic to everything that you do or not do or don't do. So I think it's at least something that it's almost like we're creating a sort of in between, like a sort of what's the word? Not heaven, not hell, but in between, a purgatory, if you will, for people to live
Limbo.
in
I,
limbo.
I like that word more. It's just funny.
Yeah, limbo. That I think people can be suspended in limbo in a sense, so as to achieve balance. As to me, this would be the ultimate ideal of balance, is some kind of limbo between A and B, heaven and hell, logic and
Isn't
not.
that what we got?
And this is what we're always striving for, exactly. And so if you're going to live in a manner that at the same time drives you, but you're not being pushed, you know what I mean? You're being driven, but you're not being driven at the same time. You're going to live your life without having to question purpose, but at the same time fulfill it. Then you need to do it by existing in limbo, by that perfect balance, right? Because this is the problem people always have. It's like, well, how am I supposed to fulfill a purpose if I don't know what it is? But it's like, you don't need to know what purpose is. Purpose is something that is intrinsic to your life. So if you understand it in that manner, then you can fulfill whatever it is you're going to fulfill. So it's inevitable in a sense.
You can appreciate existence a bit more.
Exactly.
One of the great benefits of this is that you get to kind of smell the roses without stopping.
Oh, that's beautiful. You can smell the roses without stopping. That is exactly the sentiment that I've been trying to express simply, is ever since living with paradoxism as our philosophy. And again, I was talking to my friend Mario the other day, and I was telling him, like, the reason for why you became my mentor is because you've been living this paradoxism through more of a meditative approach, because I think that's what meditators do in a sense. You know, people who meditate, they kind of live um, with that sentiment that you're sort of smelling the roses without even having to stop. That to
Well,
me is,
and we can think about it conceptually again. What are you doing when you're meditating? Is a lot of people see it as like, oh, well, what you're trying to contact the ultimate frequency, and you don't have to get into that kind of talk. What you could simply say is, well, I'm telling my body I don't need to do anything. I am good here. I don't need to engage in any activity that's meant to get me somewhere else. For once, I can sit down, and at first it seems impossible, but the more you do that, the more it gets ingrained in your nervous system, and the more it gets ingrained in your nervous system, the more your consciousness kind of takes on that flow, and things balance out.
yeah,
You think differently.
it's you fulfill purpose without needing to know what it is or having to decide what it is. It's just your being. You know, that's why meditation is so fucking powerful. Um, it's just interesting that now we can perhaps give that feeling and that kind of way of being, that way of living, uh, more of a, let's say, thought-based kind of explanation,
Yeah,
right? Because obviously, you know, you can meditate for yourself, but how are you going to, you know, make actual decisions in your day-to-day life? You can make them a lot better if you meditate. Things are more clear. But at the end of
yeah.
the day, the decisions still come from your mind, from the same mind that thinks rather than meditates. So there's like a duality at hand there. Um, but if you find the boundary between the two, then you realize that you're making decisions without having to make them. And that's where, again, the paradoxical talk is just going to continue. We're going to keep going around in circles to try to explain this feeling.
But
But
it's funny, and that's something I've been kind of scared of with this podcast, is that we're kind of repeating the same shit again and again. I'm pretty sure we probably use sentences that we've used before in other podcasts, but we're saying it a little bit differently. So we're just circling the same thing over and over and over again. But guess what? That's life.
that's life. It's all, that's what everything, that's how it works exactly.
And it's beautiful.
It's absolutely beautiful. Um, we're fulfilling purpose. It's just, we seem to be fulfilling purpose of fulfilling purpose for people. It's kind of a weird, you know, we're just sort of further into that fractal kind of development, if you will. That's a kind of a really weird way to explain it. I think you understand what I mean, but a lot of people will be like, "Ooh, that sounds like some woo-woo."
Well, okay, I mean, the main thing that we need to do is get more regular so that we come up with more metaphors and examples.
Well, I think the rose one is absolutely fucking beautiful.
Thanks.
So I'm gonna have to write that one down.
Just came up with it.
Yeah. So okay, so now we've talked about purpose and how it's paradoxical, but let's
And
go
how
on
it,
to
ultimately we connected it to infinite regress. So we're connecting all these things together little by little.
exactly. Beautiful, beautiful connecting the dots there. So let's move into morality. That's the fun one. So this is where I think it's more than just a duality. See, morality seems to be something that's a little bit more complex than just, you know, there is a paradox at the root of morality, um, which I think would be relativism. That's where the paradox lies, moral relativity. But there seems to be two other functions, main function. I mean, there's different types of morality, of course, but there seems to be three. Relativity would be in between the two. So one of them is um, objectivity, moral objectivity, and then the other one on the other side of moral relativity would be naturalism, naturality, if you will, which would be like evolutionary humanism, which is the idea that the cause and effect, the chain of cause and effect in itself dictates the morality, right? So what Hume described as being, you can't derive an ought from an is, would be the statement that he made, which basically contradicts the idea that, yeah, morality does come from nature. It just, the way things are is the way they should be. Um, Obviously,
One guy I heard I think it was a guru or something, and someone asked him, "So what if we had no laws?" This is how it came up in conversation. What would happen? Would everyone just rape and kill each other? And the guy asked the guy who's asking the question, "Well, do you want to rape and kill everyone?"
Mm-hmm.
So you gotta. It's.
It's
I'm not saying that we should have no laws or anything here, but
well, here's where I think I'm discovering something new. Is maybe there is a paradox at the base of um, moral naturality as well, because you just sort of kind of demonstrated it, right? I mean, there has to be a component of morality is rooted in physicality, right? I mean, Sam Harris makes a good argument for it, right? Science can just uncover to some degree a sense of morality. There's a representation of better balance if you look at biology and physics and all these kinds of things. So moral naturality, obviously, I think, is paradoxical in nature because, on the one hand, the way things are the way things are, right? Why is it that we are human beings? Maybe you could say, if we were to take the moral objectivist approach, maybe we shouldn't be humans. Maybe we should have been, aliens with 4 arms and whatever, kind of like Shiva or something like that. So why aren't we those things? Because it's just a brute fact. The physics brought us to being human beings that eat, drink, piss, shit, fuck, fight. So, moral naturality to some degree is true, but at the same time, there is a lack that exists with moral naturality. Just because it seems to be more moral to support the individual than it does the society, it doesn't mean that you should ignore society's needs. So this is where evolutionary humanism came into play, right? With World War II, Nazis, blah blah blah. Is that the idea of moral naturality? Just because we're the strongest in nature, and this is the way nature works, is the strongest survive to propagate better life forward. It seems very moral as an idea. It's like, yeah, of course, we don't want. There are reasons for why we don't want cousins fucking each other and all this kind of stuff and having babies, because it's not moral. I mean, you're creating life that will suffer. But suffering is intrinsic to nature as well. So is it immoral? Is suffering immoral? Is that what that says? No.
It's a balance.
There's a balance there, exactly. So I mean, and also, just because the strong, it's like nature versus nurture, the strong survive and to create better offspring, and then that seems to be moral. Does it mean that we should just not help the weak and just let them suffer? That in itself is also immoral. So again, there is a paradox within moral naturality, is what I'm trying to say.
That's funny because, I mean, anyone who quotes Darwin as saying it's only survival of the fittest is a fucking idiot, because, I mean, I don't love Darwin personally. Not to say that I have anything against the evolutionary theory, but I mean, he said himself that a large part of the survival is also cooperation.
Yeah, exactly. Like define fit, right?
Yeah.
Define fit. Like maybe this is what
someone who might seem weak in most ways. Well, for example, in most indigenous cultures, in most tribes people, the person who was either the weakest or had a serious injury, or what was called a shaman sickness, a sickness that caused them to not really be probably as good a hunter or something, was often the medicine man or a counselor to the chief or something like that, because then they could sit back and observe things, and they didn't spend all their time focusing on hunting. They could put their minds to other things, so that when big decisions need to be made or someone had a disease that needed to be treated, they were able to come from a different place, right? They were technically weaker, but they had their purpose.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, they propagated morality. They created a more moral sort of society because they were helping. And we consider this to be morality, right? We base. So I think there's a bit. Here's one of the roots of moral naturality that seems to transcend the other two types of morality. And it's the idea that the golden rule, right? It has the idea that we understand that we want to go towards pleasure and avoid pain. This has to do with naturality. It has to do with physics. It has to do with raw, sheer experience. So even in moral relativism and moral objectivism, there's this idea of moral naturality, which is, all natural things seem to avoid one kind of experience and go towards the other. So again, the paradox is within a paradox within a paradox. This is where I think morality becomes a little bit more complex. Is as you keep going further into humanity, if you will, right? Like we started with the first paradox, which is the infinite, which just gave us our foundation. We went to the second, which was to talk about purpose, right? And purpose seems to be something that is a duality as well. It's just a second paradox, but that resides within the first. And then we go further into human purpose, which is to, live out happy lives. And again, happiness has to do with morality. So morality is like a logical conclusion. But this seems to be a third component, which has three paradoxes within each other, right? Which is those three types of morality. I just want to clarify and maybe visualize that, what we're talking about a little bit more.
Well, here's another way to put it. Sure, you can say, well, great. That means there is, in a sense, morality because of cooperation and, well, okay, that leaves you at a place where you're like, cool. So we're all cooperating here, but I can still fuck around a bit if I can get away with it, and it doesn't really harm people too much, and they don't know it's me, and maybe they don't notice. But no, because what happens there is this gets to another thing. It's a reflection of these kinds of things on the conscious aspect. Because as soon as, say, you kill someone and you get away with it, then what you're doing is you're putting yourself in a situation where you start seeing the rest of the world being that way. You understand? You've created a world where you're forced to kind of be paranoid. It's a very slippery slope.
I think what you're pointing out is very interesting. It seems to be the interface between the individual and the society. That's where moral naturality breaks down.
Yeah, the inner and the outer.
Yeah, like both. Like you said, if your inner perspective of morality is that if you can get away with something, you might as well do it, then you're in nature, by virtue of you as an individual doing that, are creating a society that works out that way. So,
and you're also creating an inner climate that is highly dysfunctional over time.
Yeah, it's dysfunctional for your own. This is why we don't murder, right? Or you don't even eat your own kind, because we can see very quickly how that devolves into absolute chaos and clearly immoral things that all people, again, breaking the golden rule of avoiding pain. So, which is kind of strange because it's the same. That golden rule is the same. Is part of that same morality. It's a subset, right? If it's a golden rule, it has to do with moral naturality, which is the experience of pain and pleasure. But at the same time, if you negate other people's pain and pleasures, then you become immoral, even if you just stick to brute moral naturality, because you're actually going to cause yourself displeasure and pain if you cause others pain. So it's like a foolproof, even moral naturality is almost like a foolproof closed system. The problem is just that it keeps you from doing bad things, but it doesn't tell you what good things are necessarily.
So what's fun about this is
where moral relativism and moral objectivism come into play. But I just wanted to set the groundwork.
And we're not saying that there is no moral gray ground. There are shades. Unfortunately, there are shades of morality, but at the same time, there are things that are clearly moral and there are things that are not.
Yeah.
But I'll just say this: what's fun about this is that we're offering a third option as outside of just religious morality versus objective or scientific morality. This is a philosophical morality, which actually kind of says that both are right, because you could see this as being a perfect design of some kind of creator that is way beyond anything that we can conceive of, something that can create the perfection of mathematics, which you could call God, and I think is perfectly valid, though maybe don't anthropomorphize them and make up rules that you think that they've made up. Instead, look at how reality actually works on both subtle and gross levels, which is what we're trying to do. It's as if, it's weird because you could say either it's a perfect system, I don't know how to put it into words at this point. It's it could have been created as an extension of perfection, or it just was. But what I'm talking about in terms of perfection is that it was created by something beyond time, beyond limitation. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think the best way to resume what you're saying is not to think about it as a creator and a creation, but to think of creation as something that's intrinsic to itself. Again, like if you think about something coming before something else, right? If we think about things
Exactly.
in a linear fashion, that's where we tend to go wrong. But it's understandable that we do this, and it's because we evolved to do that, right? I mean, if you don't think in a linear fashion, right, which basically has to do with,
We're born and we die, so we see things.
yeah, one, it's the nature of how our the material that is us, how we function in this universe is this fluidity of matter, which ultimately puts you into this frame of mind that has to do with the arrow of time, right? Past, present, and future. But it's also how we evolved to understand the universe for purposes of survival, right? So, um, I think the best way to talk about what you're or think about what you're talking about is to not think of this kind of morality or purpose or any kind of complex, sophisticated systems like this as a creation that is created. It seems to be just an inductive kind of thing. It's
That's
unfolded.
a good word for it,
It's
yeah.
necessity. Yeah, it's like a flower just opening. The flower is and was and always will be. It's a brute fact, and it opens itself. You know what I mean? Infinitely. And so this is why we seem to be never ending in our discovery of this philosophy. We seem to be getting more and more sophisticated and seeing more and more patterns. It becomes more and more integrated, and we see more and more connections, and we can have this discussion, and we've already had it many, many times. And who knows, we could maybe have it for the rest of our lives until we're old men,
Probably.
and we'd still be talking about new things and making new connections because it's intrinsic. There's an intrinsic quality to the nature of reality. Everything is creative rather than a creator and a creation. We could just say everything is creative. This would
Well,
be a
it's
better alternative.
again arguing for the perspective of there being a God, but not in maybe the way most people see it. They say God is everything, right?
Yeah.
Well, everything's creating itself constantly, and always has, and always
Yeah.
will.
It's a
It's
matter of semantics. I mean, at the end of the
yes,
day,
exactly.
regardless of what humans think about, or regardless of how we decide to define the nature of reality, whether it's something creating something else, or whether it's God, or whether it's just pure infinite regress, whatever it is, it's going to be regardless of what we say. So
Yep.
why don't we define it in a manner that's more inclusive of everybody's ideology, which would be that everything is creative. I mean, it's creativity, pure creativity in a sense. Um,
I
so
will say though that you can't include everyone. You can't tolerate the intolerable,
no,
or the
no,
un,
you're right. People can always choose to, but the point is, you can be as inclusive as you can possibly be.
yes.
And this is a lot more inclusive than choosing one thing or another. This seems to be more inclusive of everybody's ideology. Now, someone could always go against it and say, no, I don't believe that, or this is the way I see things. It's like, yeah, great. But at the end of the day, we're not even making an argument. We're just, you know, giving a name to something. That's it. But to go back to the morality thing, so I think we're kind of making some interesting progress there. So we were talking about naturality, which is the idea that nature is a certain way, therefore it should be a certain way, and in a sense, it kind of has no choice to be a certain way. So in that sense, more, Hume was right. What Hume was pointing at was that even though you can't derive a not from an is, even though something is a certain way, it should not necessarily be that way. But I think we fail to mention that regardless of something having to be one way or another, it's inevitable that it is a certain way as well. So nature is the way it is. It's developed the way it is. Now we can consciously try to change that, but that will be part of our nature. It will be part of existence. So at the end of the day, Hume is right, but he's also neglected that fact, I think. So moral naturality has this idea that it's intrinsically moral. The way things develop in nature, the way we evolve, is moral. It is a good thing. But it doesn't tell us how we should evolve and make decisions. That's the problem, right? So that's where moral relativism and moral objectivism come into play. So, because we just basically had explained how moral naturality only takes you so far. It breaks down, and it's like a closed system in itself. It allows you to be moral just by being what you are, but it can collapse on itself if you ignore or if you don't strive for different kinds of moralities. Because
You
if
constantly have to strive for morality.
yeah,
You constantly
but
uh, trying to be good involve the trying to be good necessitates constantly trying to refine and understand what good is.
exactly, it's never ending, right? And again, this is congruent or compatible with everything we've been talking about. The infinite. It's an infinite. Everything is an infinite process, right? Again, infinite regress, like you said. We can invert it and say it's progress. Doesn't matter. Regress, progress. These words lose meaning at the end of the day. We're dealing with an infinite here. The infinite has no progress or regress. We think of things in those terms because of, like I said, the linear thought process, past, present, future. But at the end of the day, it's all just the infinite. So I guess that's a good statement at this point. We can, being as the title of this podcast is Infinite Regress. At the end of the day, it's all the infinite. Regress or progress,
Right.
whatever it is.
It's funny because I was going to say before we end, we should tie it back into infinite regress, but there you go. Took care of itself.
It's just the way
And it
things work
always
out.
does.
Yeah. Okay, so having reiterated that again, the moral relativism now, the idea that things are moral in one area of space-time. So in China, because they live a certain way, it seems to be moral because they chose that for themselves. Whereas here in America, certain different things are moral because it's moral within, our bounds. But that can quickly be debunked because obviously globalization and also morality seems to be something that pervades existence. At least that's how we see morality. That's how we try to create morality is that it should be moral for everybody and everything, regardless of ideology. Something that pervades mere differences between people. Because, like, again, is it just because in some Arab countries the culture makes it so that it's moral to keep your women in a bag, right?
Well, that's not morality. That's the law.
Yeah, that's the law, but the laws are founded on morality, right?
Well, no, those are the laws of their God.
Yeah,
It's
but we can talk about those things as well. But ultimately, everything relies down on. It starts with purpose. And then after purpose comes morality, and then how do you enforce morality with laws? Right.
well, yeah. I mean, I think morality and law is two different things, and the interaction between the two we have to
Yeah.
discuss.
Well, exactly. But they're absolutely related, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's just I think often that the connection between the two isn't really explored all that much.
Well, I don't know. I mean, well, actually, you're right. It should be clarified a lot more. I mean, why is it that we have people making certain bills just out of nowhere? They're doing it not out of morality, but they're doing it out of economic efficiency and other sort of standards, which isn't, you know, I
Yeah.
mean, it's arguable that you can't just make laws purely based on morality. I mean, we wouldn't
And
perhaps.
is it morality if you believe it's just a law that your God made? Is that morality?
Exactly, exactly. So that's why I'm trying to talk about moral relativism, and what you're talking about is objectivism a little bit more. So, um, the idea that moral relativity, uh, see, again, we demonstrated how naturality only takes you so far. You need more. So, can you use relativism? Yes, to some degree. I mean, as human beings, I don't interact with people in China every day. So, I mean, whatever seems to be the natural evolution of our morality in my community, that seems to be moral. And then I can accept that people far away can have something completely different and maybe even immoral to my standards, but I still accept it, and that in itself is a morality. I accept that their morality is just as valid as my own because they deal with that lifestyle. So
I need more. People bring that argument up a lot that morality is different from culture to culture. And I hate to say it, but I have yet to see a decent example. I mean, yes, I've seen small examples, but here, murder, rape, and theft,
yeah,
it's pretty universal. There are some pretty black and white things, and I understand that even within murder, there's self-defense and
yeah.
all that. There are nuances, but there's
But
some pretty basic.
so so here's where it becomes a duality again, and paradoxical, because moral relativism tries to stay true to the golden rule, and at the same time it ignores it. There is the paradox, right? Because on the one hand, I'm not in China every day, so why the fuck should I impose my morality on them? They should deal the way they feel like they want to live. That's moral. I'm being moral from the standpoint of respecting another human being. Do as to others as you would have them do unto you. So they're respecting the golden rule, which is again part of moral naturality. So all these things are connected, like I said. So moral relativity comes from moral naturality. It tries to respect the golden rule, but at the same time, there when you start to integrate, obviously, like when you start to interact with these other groups, then moral natural relativity breaks down as well. There goes that's the segue into the third and final moral necessity, which is moral objectivity. And moral objectivity is literally just humans creating absolutes, saying this is the way things should be, and these are the best fundamentals that we can think of that will create a better environment for morality, going back down the chain. So going back into relativity, going back into naturality. And isn't it funny? Moral objectivity is what? It's a constant. It's an absolute, and that absolute is the foundation, right? It's the infinite. It's there. It's forever. The law, right? When God says it's this, well, it's this forever. Which is ironic that that gets broken too, because people
I
say, "Oh
think
yeah,
I
well,
think
God came back and He changed the rules." You know, that's what the Muslims do, right? They're like, yeah, well, He had to come back and humans fucked up the text and you rectified a couple things. But the point is, you can see how all these things are really coming together.
look, I just because I think something that hasn't been sitting right with me since we've been talking about morality is just that you're using the term moral relativity a little bit differently than a lot of people do, I think. Because the way it's often used is, well, morality is relative, so there is no such thing as real morality, so there is no real morality, which is bullshit. You have to take it the other way is, well, there's no set morality, but there is an ideal that we constantly need to strive towards. And it is objective, but it is from moment to moment
Yeah, I think you're just
within the context of individualized relative reality.
yeah.
It's not always obvious, but you need to constantly strive towards it.
Yeah, so I haven't dealt with extremes yet. I mean, obviously there's an extreme when I did with the moral naturality, right? I mean, you can take that to a logical conclusion and say, oh yeah, nature versus nurture is the way it is, so that's why I'm going to go kill the Jews, right? That obviously doesn't work. It breaks down. But you're talking about the extreme form of moral relativity, and again, I don't think there's value in that. I mean, but like you said, it wasn't sitting right. Yes, we should mention how that breaks down as well. So yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, just because morality is in part relative, it doesn't mean that there is no necessity, at the very least, for an objective morality. Um, like you said, an ideal. Because obviously moral relativity breaks down. Just because if it's all relative, well then at any time you can do whatever you want. And there you go. Well, that breaks the golden rule. The golden rule is something everybody believes in, and if they say they don't, well then I'm just going to punch them in the face and then tell them, well, it's all relative. Why don't you why you don't want to keep going? Right? It's relative. Your pain is fine, right? Well, it doesn't make sense. So, moral objectivity is the third and final one, and at the same time brings us back to the infinite, right? How are you going to set those things down? And again, if we observe the frequencies, the sort of patterns we were talking about from the beginning, if we sort of pay attention to not nature, not reality or existence, but the interaction between, the two kinds of infinites, the way we think about the infinite, which is existence and non-existence, perhaps we can extract some kind of moral objectivity. The first one seems to be follow paradoxism. I mean, that's what Taoism's and Buddhism's about, meditation, all this kind of shit. It seems to be this balance between two things, right? It's a duality.
What it relates to is harmony.
Yeah.
Interaction, relationship. If you're a really big guy and no one is left in the world to impose the law on you, and you're kind of hungry and you don't really feel like going hunting, but there's one other human being there and they're really small and you could kill them on the spot, will you do it? That's a question. Or would you rather interact, harmonize, have a relationship, enjoy yourself, and maybe deal with a bit of discomfort, but be able to grow from there, develop a relationship, work together and benefit each other. So.
Exactly. And whatever side of the fence you're on, it seems to be inevitable that there will be people on both sides of fences, and the balance gets restored ultimately somehow in a greater concentric circle. But if you as an individual wants to live out a higher ideal, it seems to be through a paradoxical means that you have to do it.
And the main thing that I'm saying is, or that we're saying is, that's what's going to lead to the best life that you can live, the best quality of life, the most enjoyable experience of consciousness. And unfortunately, we can't impose this on anyone because even when you have laws, the people who impose the laws, there can always be people who climb up above that and who just don't see it that way. But you can't worry about that at that point. You got to do what you can do. And what I like about this paradoxism is that it makes you aware of the fact that those people will always exist, and you still have to stay balanced and be wary of them and deal with it.
Absolutely.
There's room for pure people and evil people. Always. Absolutely.
I think it's a good way to sort of kind of come to a close here. I mean,
we went a little bit all over the place, but
yeah, but I think it got more and more clear as we went along. We still need to work out our sort of podcast skills, but at the end of the day, if this isn't good for anybody else, it's definitely been good for us. We're definitely coming closer and closer to understanding the concepts and framing the arguments in different ways. We're honing our skills. Yeah, so if anybody has anything to say ever, please send us a shout out. It'd be nice to get some opinions. maybe point out some flaws or,
Questions.
questions. Anything. All right. Peace out.